In the village of Azigbo, a place tucked away between the lush hills of the southern lands, life moved to the rhythm of ancient customs. It was a village known for its beauty and the strength of its people, their bond with the earth and the spirits around them. The air was thick with the smell of fresh earth, sweet fruits, and the endless hum of voices, but under the serene surface, there were whispers that carried tales of cruelty and injustice. This village, with its vibrant festivals and wise elders, was not immune to the darkness of human nature. At the heart of this village, where the sun bathed the land in golden light, lived a girl named Adise. She was beautiful, her skin a rich blend of gold and brown, her eyes deep pools of warmth, and her hair like a dark river that cascaded down her back. From the moment she was born, the villagers spoke of her beauty, and her gentle spirit became a source of pride for her late father. Adise's smile could melt the hardest hearts, and her laugh was like the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Yet, beneath the surface of this delicate exterior, there was a quiet strength that no one truly understood, not even Adise herself. After her father passed, Adise's life took a turn for the worse when her mother remarried a woman named Ugochi. Ugochi was a woman of sharp wit and even sharper ambition. She was clever, cunning, and well-liked by the village for her charm, but she harbored a deep bitterness, one that only grew as time passed. She looked upon Adise with jealousy, envy clawing at her insides. Ugochi could not stand the thought that Adise, her stepdaughter, could inherit the beauty and grace that the village so admired. In her eyes, Adise was a threat to her own power, a reminder of her husband's former love. As time passed, Ugochi's cruelty began to manifest in subtle ways. She started by denying Adise the comforts that a young girl of her age should have. While her own children were fed lavish meals, Adise's plate was often empty. She would go days without food, forced to work harder than anyone else in the house. Ugochi's jealousy festered like a wound that refused to heal, and each day Adise found herself sinking deeper into silence, unsure of what to do or how to escape. Ugochi kept her under her thumb, knowing that the girl would not speak out, and she took advantage of Adise's quiet nature. The work Adise was tasked with was grueling. She woke before the sun, spent long hours sweeping the compound, fetching water from the distant well, and tending to the animals. When she wasn't doing chores, she was forced to cook meals for the family, preparing food for Ugochi's children while she herself barely ate. Every task, no matter how exhausting, was met with Ugochi's cold, calculating gaze, as if every chore was a reminder of her stepdaughter's place. Beneath her, nothing more than a servant. Adise never complained. There was no shouting, no resistance. She simply did as she was told, her body weakening with each passing day, but her spirit remained steadfast. She did not speak, not out of fear, but because she understood something far deeper than the hunger that gnawed at her. Adise knew that there was a power in silence, that to remain still and patient was sometimes the only way to protect oneself from the harsh winds of the world. She was not broken, though she appeared so. In her heart, there was a quiet fire burning, one that no one could extinguish, not even Ugochi. In the stillness of the night, as Adise lay in her bed, the shadows of her room would dance in the moonlight, and she would often find herself staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the village drifting through the walls. There was an ancient wisdom that ran through her veins, passed down from generations long past. She had heard the stories of the ancestors, the ones who had overcome insurmountable odds and whose names were still spoken with reverence. Adise did not fully understand this power yet, but she felt it stirring within her, like the rumble of a storm far away on the horizon. It was in these moments of solitude that Adise would close her eyes and call out to the spirits. She did not speak loudly, but her prayers were sincere. She begged the spirits to watch over her, to give her the strength to endure this pain and injustice. She did not ask for vengeance or retribution, she only asked for patience and clarity. She knew that there was more to life than this suffering, but she had no idea how to break free from the chains that bound her. Meanwhile, Ugochi continued her manipulation. She fed her children the finest foods, dressed them in fine clothes, and lavished them with attention. She would sit in the courtyard, laughing with friends and gossiping about the village, while Adise worked silently in the background, unnoticed and unappreciated. Ugochi made sure that everyone in the village knew how lazy Adise was, how she was always lost in thought, and never did anything right. The villagers, ignorant to the truth, believed her lies. They did not see the suffering that lay behind Adise's quiet demeanor, they only saw a girl who did not fit in, who was different from her step-siblings. And yet, despite the cruelty she faced, Adise's silence was not a sign of defeat. She had become an expert at hiding her pain, a master of endurance. Each day was a struggle, but she held on to the belief that there was something greater at work, something that could not be undone by the mere hands of Ugochi. Adise did not know it yet, but the storm inside her was beginning to grow, and soon the world would feel its force. In her heart she carried the lessons of her ancestors. Lessons of resilience, of endurance, and of the quiet strength that lay in waiting. Adise knew that one day her suffering would end, but she also knew that she had to endure it, just as the earth endures the rains. She could not yet see the path ahead, but deep down she knew that her silence would be the key to her survival. The world may not hear her now, but someday they would listen. As the days dragged on, Adise's resolve only grew stronger. The more Ugochi starved her, the more Adise's spirit soared. She would not let this injustice break her. She knew that one day the day would come when the world would see her not as a helpless girl, but as someone capable of changing the very air around her. And when that day arrived, Ugochi would know exactly what it meant to have wronged the wrong person. The village of Azigbo, with all its beauty and its cruelty, would soon witness the power of a girl who had nothing but silence and the will of the ancestors on her side. As the days stretched on, the village of Azigbo carried on with its usual rhythm, seemingly unaware of the suffering that took place behind the walls of the home where Adise lived. She had been reduced to a mere shadow of herself, her once vibrant energy now barely a flicker. Each day, her body grew weaker from the constant hunger, the exhausting labor, and the coldness of her stepmother's cruelty. But despite the physical toll that this torment had taken on her, Adise's spirit remained unyielding. There was a strength inside her that no amount of hunger, exhaustion, or hardship could extinguish. It was as though the cruel treatment only fueled her inner fire, deepening her connection to the spirit world. Her heart, though weary, still held a quiet defiance. Adise was not the type to cry out for help, nor would she ever beg for sympathy. She had learned, over the years, that silence was often the most powerful form of resistance. In her silence, she had begun to learn things that no one had taught her: the wisdom of patience, the endurance of the earth, and the power of the unseen world that whispered in the winds. Despite the loneliness and deprivation, Adise continued to pray. Every night, she would sit by the window in the dark, staring up at the moon and calling out to the spirits of her ancestors. She knew that they watched over her, though their presence was always faint, just out of reach. Her voice was a whisper in the wind, but it carried the weight of generations. In her heart, she begged them to restore her strength, to grant her the power to overcome the cruelty she faced. She did not wish harm upon Ugochi, but she prayed that the spirits would see the injustice of it all and bring the balance back into her life. One night, as the winds outside howled and the darkness seemed to deepen around her, something unusual happened. Adise was kneeling by the window, her hands pressed together in prayer, when she heard a voice. It was not a voice she recognized, nor was it the voice of anyone in the house. It was a voice that seemed to come from the very wind itself, a soft, low murmur that echoed in her ears, faint yet undeniable. "Adise," the voice whispered, "the power within you is ancient. The time to awaken it has come." The words sent a chill down her spine, and for a moment she froze, unsure if she had imagined it. But the voice continued, clearer this time, like a distant rumble in the heart of the storm. "You are the child of the earth, the blood of your ancestors. The power flows through you and it will guide you." The voice faded, but the feeling it left behind lingered in the air, thick with an energy that Adise had never felt before. She looked out the window, her eyes scanning the dark landscape. The world around her seemed to shift subtly, as though the earth itself had listened to the ancient words. The trees, once still and unmoving, now appeared to sway in rhythm with the winds, as though acknowledging the call that Adise had made. The animals that had once been her silent companions on the outskirts of the village now appeared in the shadows, their eyes glowing faintly, watching her with a kind of knowing. The following days brought more changes. Adise could no longer explain the sense of power that was growing within her. It was as though the very fabric of the world had shifted, and she was becoming part of something greater than herself. She noticed things she had never seen before: the way the wind carried the scent of the earth's secrets, the way the trees whispered in the night, their branches reaching out toward her as though beckoning her to listen. As she walked through the village, she saw the animals that had once scurried out of her path now stand still, their eyes following her every move. They no longer fled in fear. Instead, they regarded her with a sense of reverence, as though they recognized her for what she was becoming. Adise felt a strange connection to them, as though they understood her suffering and offered their silent support. The birds would perch on the rooftops, and the dogs that used to bark at her now lay quietly by her feet. And then there was the wind. The wind that had always been a natural part of life in Azigbo now seemed to carry something else, something that called to her in a language older than time. It was as though the earth itself had begun to speak to her, whispering words of power, of wisdom, and of ancient knowledge that Adise had never known. The wind seemed to know her name, and every time it passed, it stirred something deep within her chest, as though it was awakening a force she had never fully understood. Despite the changes she was experiencing, Adise's physical pain did not cease. She still felt the sharp pangs of hunger gnawing at her insides, her body weakened from the years of neglect. But now there was a different kind of strength rising within her, a force that was far greater than her physical needs. She could feel it in her chest, in the deep well of her soul. The hunger no longer consumed her in the same way. It was as if her spirit was starting to transcend the physical suffering, drawing strength from the very earth beneath her feet. It was as though the silent suffering she had endured for so long had become the catalyst for a deeper transformation. Her body was weak, but her spirit was growing stronger by the day. The more she prayed, the more the wind seemed to respond, swirling around her in patterns she had never seen before. The animals, the trees, the earth, everything around her began to move in harmony, as if the forces of nature themselves were attuned to her inner awakening. Adise no longer felt like a victim. She was no longer the girl who had been cast aside and forgotten. She was beginning to feel the stirrings of something greater within her, a force that had been dormant for so long, waiting for the right moment to emerge. She had always been told that silence was her strength, but now she realized that it was not silence alone that held her power. It was the ability to listen, to hear the voices of the ancestors, to understand the language of the earth, and to know the power that lay hidden within her. With each passing day her resolve grew stronger. She was not just waiting for the suffering to end anymore, she was preparing for something. Something greater than revenge, something that would change the course of her life forever. She felt the stirrings of power in her fingertips, in her breath, and in the rhythm of the world around her. Adise was awakening, and she knew that the time was coming when she would no longer be the girl who suffered in silence. She was becoming something more, something that no one could stop. The wind whispered her name, and Adise knew that she was no longer just a girl. She was becoming a force that would change the destiny of those who had wronged her. And as the wind swirled around her, she felt her heart beat in sync with the world, the ancient rhythms that had always been there but had never been truly heard until now. Ugochi's jealousy had grown over the years, like a malignant shadow that clung to her every step. It consumed her, taking root deep within her heart until it spread to every corner of their home. The love she once claimed to have for Adise was gone, replaced by a cold, bitter resentment. Adise's beauty, her quiet strength, and the purity of her spirit became sources of Ugochi's torment. Each day the stepmother found new ways to make the girl's life a living nightmare. Ugochi's cruelty escalated. She stopped feeding Adise altogether, only offering scraps when she was feeling particularly spiteful. The few morsels of food that were given to her were hardly enough to keep her alive, let alone nourish her body. Ugochi, however, ensured that her own children were well fed, stuffing their mouths with food while Adise looked on, her stomach growling in agony. But the stepmother did not care. To her, Adise was a mere tool to be used for her own advantage, someone to exploit and break until there was nothing left. The tasks given to Adise became increasingly impossible. From dawn until dusk she was forced to labor, fetching water from the distant well, tending to the garden, cleaning the house and caring for the animals. These tasks were not ones meant for a child of her age and frail constitution, yet Ugochi showed no mercy. She would lash out at Adise for the smallest of mistakes, calling her lazy and incompetent. Ugochi's words were like poison, slowly eroding the girl's spirit, but Adise refused to show weakness. She knew that showing any sign of vulnerability would only make things worse. As the days wore on, Adise's body began to weaken. Her skin grew pale and drawn, her limbs trembled from the lack of food, and her once glowing eyes became dull and hollow. Yet, despite the physical toll, there was something else that was happening. Something mystical, something that Adise herself could not yet fully understand. Her emotions became more intense, like a storm building within her chest. Every day she could feel the power growing inside of her, pushing against the constraints of her fragile body. It was as though the very air around her had begun to respond to her inner turmoil. Strange things began to happen around the house. Objects that had once been stationary now moved on their own. The once still walls of the home seemed to breathe with a life of their own, shifting slightly as if they too were aware of the changes that Adise was undergoing. The weather outside mirrored Adise's inner conflict. The skies grew darker, the winds grew stronger, and the thunder rumbled in the distance as though the heavens themselves were preparing for something. The villagers, who had always been too busy with their own lives to notice Adise's suffering, began to whisper amongst themselves. Some spoke of the strange weather patterns, others of the unsettling feeling that had settled over the village like a dark cloud. The change was palpable, but no one could understand its source. Within the confines of the house, Adise could feel the power building inside her, a force she could not explain but knew was there. It was as though her ancestors were calling to her, urging her to listen to the ancient wisdom that flowed through her veins. At first she resisted. She had always been a quiet, passive girl, trained to endure hardship without complaint. But now, with the cruelty of her stepmother growing unbearable, Adise could feel something breaking inside her, something deep and primal that refused to be silenced any longer. One night, after being pushed to the brink by Ugochi's relentless cruelty, Adise reached her breaking point. She was starving, exhausted, and broken in body and spirit, but the power that had been stirring within her now surged with a force that could no longer be contained. With tears in her eyes, she stood in the middle of the house, the silence pressing down on her like a heavy weight. She looked around at the dimly lit room, the same room where she had endured so much suffering, and whispered softly to the spirits that had always watched over her. "Ancestors, hear me," Adise said, her voice trembling but strong. "I have suffered in silence for too long. I have been forgotten by the world, left to starve and suffer at the hands of those who should care for me. Show me that I am not alone. Give me a sign that you are with me, that you have not abandoned me." As she spoke these words, the house seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, there was no sound, no movement, just the quiet whisper of the wind outside and the faint rumble of thunder in the distance. Adise closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her ancestors' presence growing stronger around her. And then, as though her plea had pierced the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds, a surge of power filled her entire being. It started as a subtle warmth, a heat that spread from her chest to the tips of her fingers and toes. It was the same warmth she had felt when the voice spoke to her in the wind, but this time it was different. This time it was not just a whisper, it was a roar. The power surged through her, flooding her veins with the strength of her ancestors. She could feel their presence in her bones, in the very air around her. It was as though the world itself had aligned with her call, answering her plea for strength and protection. The walls of the house began to shake, the objects within it rattling as if caught in the grip of some unseen force. The wind outside howled, and the sky above seemed to open up, releasing a torrent of rain. Thunder crashed overhead, loud and deafening, as if the heavens themselves were acknowledging Adise's awakening. She stood tall, feeling the surge of power course through her, and in that moment she knew that she was no longer the helpless girl she had once been. She was someone else now, someone stronger, someone connected to the very forces of nature itself. But even as the power swelled within her, Adise remained calm. She knew that this was only the beginning, that her transformation was far from complete. She could feel the presence of the spirits surrounding her, guiding her, urging her to embrace the power that had been awakened within her. It was time for her to stop being a victim of circumstance. It was time for her to take control of her destiny and change the course of her life forever. Ugochi, unaware of the changes taking place in her stepdaughter, continued to mock Adise's quiet strength. She saw the girl's silence as nothing more than submission, a weakness to be exploited. She was blind to the transformation that was occurring, too consumed by her jealousy and cruelty to see the storm that was brewing within Adise. With each cruel word, each harsh task she imposed, she pushed Adise closer to the edge. But little did she know, with every word, every sneer, she was also feeding the very power that would one day destroy her. Adise was no longer the broken, hungry girl she had been. She was a force to be reckoned with, and Ugochi's cruelty would be her undoing. The thunder rumbled once more, louder this time, as if the spirits themselves were heralding the change that was about to come. Adise was ready. The moment had arrived. And soon, Ugochi would realize that Adise was not the weak, silent girl she had once been. She was a storm waiting to break free. The village of Azigbo had always known the skies to be a place of wonder, a place where the sun bathed the land in warmth and the rains nurtured the earth. But on the day Adise received her first meal after days of starvation, the sky itself seemed to bend to her will. The clouds gathered in thick, rolling masses, and the air grew heavy, charged with an energy that set the entire village on edge. For days, Adise had been surviving on nothing but the faint hope that the spirits would answer her call. Her stepmother, Ugochi, had tried to break her, to silence her, but Adise had remained steadfast, her silence becoming a form of resistance. The days had dragged on in a blur of hunger and hardship, and yet Adise had never given in. But now, as the winds began to howl and the earth seemed to tremble beneath her feet, she knew that the moment of reckoning had arrived. The table before her was set with the first full meal she had seen in days. Ugochi, with a sneer on her face, had placed the meal before her, no doubt expecting Adise to devour it in desperation. But Adise was no longer the weak, hungry girl who had once begged for scraps. She had become something more, something powerful and ancient, and as she looked at the food before her, she felt the spirits of her ancestors surround her, guiding her every move. She sat down at the table, her hands steady and sure. As she lifted the spoon to her lips, she spoke aloud for the first time in what seemed like forever. "Give me what is mine." Her voice was calm, but there was a strength in it that sent shivers down her spine. It was as if the very air around her had responded to her words, as if the universe itself was waiting for this moment. The storm that had been gathering outside now unleashed its fury. Thunder cracked across the sky, and lightning streaked through the clouds, illuminating the land in blinding flashes of light. The wind howled around the house, rattling the windows and doors as if it were alive. The villagers, who had gathered in their homes, looked out in awe and fear, sensing that something profound was happening in the village. Adise continued to eat, her every bite filling her with a sense of power that she had never known. With each mouthful, she felt the strength of her ancestors flowing through her, filling the emptiness that had once been inside her. The food was no longer just sustenance, it was a symbol of her rebirth, a sign that she was no longer the girl she had been. She was something more now, something that could not be broken, something that had been chosen by the spirits themselves. Ugochi watched from the doorway, her face pale and her hands trembling. She had expected to see Adise weak and desperate, but what she saw now was something entirely different. The girl was no longer the meek child who had once cowered before her. Adise was powerful, her presence commanding, and the storm that raged outside seemed to reflect the storm within her. Ugochi's heart began to race, fear creeping into her mind as she realized that she had made a grave mistake in underestimating Adise. As Adise finished her meal, the storm began to subside, the winds dying down and the clouds slowly parting to reveal the first rays of sunlight. But the village remained tense, as if the very earth was holding its breath. Adise stood from the table, her body now full of strength and purpose, and turned to face her stepmother. Ugochi's eyes widened in fear, her face a mask of disbelief. She had never seen Adise like this before. The girl's once fragile frame was now strong and regal, her eyes glowing with an inner fire that Ugochi could not comprehend. It was clear that Adise was no longer the girl she had tried to break. She was something else, something far more powerful. With a deep breath, Adise stepped forward, her every movement graceful yet deliberate. The storm outside had quieted, but the air still buzzed with energy, as if the world itself was waiting for what would come next. Adise looked at Ugochi, her gaze unwavering. The power of the spirits surged within her, and she could feel the ancestors standing beside her, watching, guiding. "You have tormented me for too long, Ugochi," Adise said, her voice steady but filled with an unyielding strength. "You thought you could break me, but you were wrong. I am not yours to control." Ugochi opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She tried to step back, but her feet felt heavy as though they were rooted to the floor. The air around them seemed to thicken, and the sky above began to rumble once more. The storm had not entirely gone, it was only waiting for Adise's command. With a wave of her hand, Adise called on the storm. The winds began to pick up once again, swirling around them with a fierce intensity. Thunder crackled overhead, and lightning illuminated the land in jagged flashes of light. The villagers, now standing outside, watched in awe as the storm seemed to follow Adise's every move. Ugochi's eyes filled with terror as she realized what was happening. She had always believed in her own power, her own ability to control and manipulate others. But now, as Adise stood before her, she could see that she had underestimated the girl completely. The power that Adise had awakened was not just physical, it was spiritual, ancient, and unyielding. "Please, Adise," Ugochi whispered, her voice shaking with fear. "Forgive me. I was wrong. Please don't let the storm destroy us." But Adise did not respond with words. Instead, she raised her hand and the storm responded, growing stronger, more intense. The wind howled like a wild animal, the rain began to fall in torrents, and the thunder roared, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. In that moment, Adise's vengeance was not one of violence. She did not need to strike her stepmother with her hands. Instead, she let the storm do the work. The skies themselves became her weapon, a force of nature that could not be controlled, a reckoning for all who had wronged her. Ugochi's cruelty was laid bare for all to see. The villagers, who had once been too blind to notice her malice, now understood the true extent of her wickedness. As the storm raged, Adise stood tall, her eyes glowing with the power of the spirits, her heart full of the strength she had always known was within her. The storm slowly began to subside, but the message was clear. Adise had reclaimed what was hers. Ugochi's hold over her was shattered, and her reign of cruelty had come to an end. The village would never be the same again, for Adise had proven that even the most silent suffering could give rise to a storm that no one could ignore. The winds calmed and the storm passed, but the power that Adise had unleashed would remain forever, a testament to her strength and the ancestors who had guided her. And as she turned away from Ugochi, she knew that this was only the beginning of her journey, a journey that would lead her to greatness, and to the rightful place she had always been destined for. The storm that had once raged with fury now settled into a calm silence. The air, once thick with energy and tension, began to clear. The villagers who had gathered in fear and awe watched in stunned silence as Adise stood before them, transformed. Her body, once frail and starved, was now strong and radiant, as if the very power of the storm had seeped into her veins, giving her a new life. No longer was she the weak girl who had suffered in silence. Adise now walked as a woman, filled with strength, wisdom, and the ancestral power that had always been within her. Her silence, which had once been seen as a sign of vulnerability, was now understood as something much deeper, a form of spiritual power, a connection to forces far beyond the comprehension of the ordinary people. The villagers who had once turned a blind eye to her suffering, now saw her with new eyes. They no longer looked at her with pity or disdain, but with reverence and respect. Adise had become a living symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of the human spirit when it is aligned with the forces of nature and the ancestors. The storm had revealed not just her physical strength, but the deep well of power within her, a power that had always been there, waiting to be awakened. But Adise did not seek revenge in the traditional sense. She could have chosen to punish those who had wronged her, to use her newfound power to exact retribution. But that was not her way. Instead, Adise chose the path of forgiveness. Her power was not meant to destroy but to teach, to guide, and to restore balance to a world that had lost its way. She took her place as a spiritual guide, no longer the silent victim but the wise teacher. She led the village in ceremonies, teaching them the importance of balance, respect for nature, and the power of silence. She spoke not with words but with actions, showing the villagers how to live in harmony with the earth and with each other. Her teachings became a source of strength for the entire community, and the village began to thrive once more, its people united in a way they had never been before. Ugochi, on the other hand, was left in isolation, stripped of her power and influence. The storm had undone her, exposing her cruelty for all to see. No longer able to manipulate others with her cunning, she was left to face the consequences of her actions. She had once been a woman who had used her strength to dominate, but now she was powerless, broken, and alone. The villagers no longer feared her, and they no longer offered her the respect she had once commanded. Instead, they pitied her, for she was now a woman haunted by the storm that Adise had called down. As the days passed, Ugochi's fate became sealed. The villagers no longer spoke of her with the same fear or reverence. They spoke of her as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of cruelty and jealousy. She became a shadow of the woman she had once been, forever haunted by the memory of the storm that Adise had invoked. She was left to wander the land alone, a broken soul, while Adise thrived, her name now spoken with admiration and respect. In the years that followed, the story of Adise became a legend, passed down through the generations. Her strength and resilience were celebrated, and her name was spoken with awe. The villagers would gather around the fire at night, telling the tale of the girl who had been starved and abused, only to rise again stronger than ever. They spoke of the storm that had come with her first meal, and how it had changed everything. They understood now that the storm was not just a force of nature but a symbol of truth. The thunder, they would say, is not just a sign of power but of truth. When a soul is tested and finds its strength, even the storm must bow before it. And so, the legend of Adise lived on, a story of triumph over cruelty, of strength found in the face of suffering. The villagers never forgot the lesson she had taught them, and the storm that had been both her curse and her blessing. As they told the story, they would pause for a moment of reflection, asking themselves the question that Adise's journey had raised. When hunger does not break you, when silence speaks louder than words, the storm will be your ally. And those who seek to destroy you will only find themselves undone. The villagers would reflect on this question, thinking about their own lives, their own struggles. They would wonder what they would have done if they were in Adise's place. If they too had been tested by hunger, cruelty, and silence, would they have found the strength to call down the storm? Would they have had the courage to stand up and face their tormentors, or would they have succumbed to despair? And as they pondered these questions, they would look to the sky, remembering the thunder that had once heralded Adise's rebirth, and they would wonder what their own storms might bring. The legend of Adise had become a part of the village's soul, a story that would live on long after the people who had witnessed it had passed. It was a story of power, resilience, and the unbreakable spirit of a woman who had found her strength in the storm. And in the end, it was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always the possibility of rebirth, of transformation, and of finding one's true power. As the final words of the legend echoed in the air, the villagers would ask themselves, if you were Adise, what would you have done when the storm called to you? The storm that had come to symbolize Adise's power, her strength, and her unyielding spirit slowly dissipated, leaving behind a calm that had not existed before. The village, once torn by cruelty, jealousy, and fear, now stood united in a new understanding of power and resilience. Adise, the girl who had been starved, silenced, and forgotten, was now the woman who had transcended all that had tried to break her. She had turned her pain into a force for good, and in doing so had transformed not only herself but her entire community. The thunder that had once echoed across the sky now seemed to resonate within the hearts of the villagers. It had been a call to action, a reminder that power does not always come from physical strength or dominance. Adise had proven that true power comes from within, an inner strength that cannot be measured by the cruelty of others or the suffering one endures. It is a strength that comes from the spirit, the ancestors, and the connection to the earth itself. Her transformation from a victim to a figure of reverence was not a simple one. It had required her to endure unimaginable hardships, to suffer in silence, and to find strength in the darkest of places. But it also required her to understand the power of forgiveness and the importance of maintaining one's integrity in the face of adversity. Adise's journey was not just one of vengeance, but one of growth, self-discovery, and ultimately, spiritual enlightenment. Her first meal, the meal that came after days of starvation, had not just been nourishment for her body, it had been a symbolic moment of rebirth. The storm that followed had not only been a manifestation of her newfound strength but also a reminder that nature, the spirits, and the ancestors are always present, watching, guiding, and waiting for those who are worthy. Adise's power had not been something that could be conjured from thin air, it had always been inside her. It was only when she was pushed to the edge, when she had nothing left but her faith and her connection to the earth, that she was able to tap into it. The storm that came with Adise's first meal had not just been a physical event, but a spiritual one. It had cleansed the land and the people, washing away the old and bringing in the new. It had been a call to the village to remember their true selves, to reconnect with the land, and to honor the spirits that had always been there. The storm was a reminder that power is not something to be feared, but something to be respected. It is not something to be used for personal gain, but something that should be used to bring balance and healing to the world. In the aftermath of the storm, the village of Azigbo began to change. The people who had once turned a blind eye to Adise's suffering now saw her with new eyes. They recognized the strength that lay within her, and they understood the lessons she had taught them. The teachings of balance, respect, and silence became the foundation upon which the village rebuilt itself. The people no longer sought to dominate the land or each other. Instead, they sought to live in harmony with the earth, to honor the ancestors, and to respect the power that flowed through them all. Adise's role as a spiritual guide was not one of dominance, but of service. She did not seek to control the village or to demand worship. Instead, she guided them, offering wisdom and teaching them how to live with intention and mindfulness. She helped them understand that true power comes not from force or violence, but from harmony and balance. She showed them that silence is not a weakness but a strength. In a world that often values noise and action above all else, Adise taught them the power of stillness, the strength of listening, and the importance of being in tune with the rhythms of nature. Her influence was not limited to the village. Word of Adise's transformation and the storm that had followed her first meal spread far and wide. Other villages began to seek her guidance, and she became a symbol of hope for those who had been oppressed, abused, or forgotten. Her story was told in whispers, then in songs, and eventually in every corner of the land. Adise had become a legend, not because of her ability to wield power, but because of her ability to transcend the limitations placed upon her. She had shown the world that even in the darkest of times, there is always the possibility of rebirth, of transformation, and of finding one's true power. Ugochi's downfall, on the other hand, was equally significant, though in a different way. She had once been a woman who had used her cunning and cruelty to dominate those around her. She had fed off the misery of others, gaining power by making others suffer. But in the end, it was her own cruelty that led to her undoing. The storm that Adise had invoked had stripped her of her power, leaving her isolated and broken. She had been exposed for what she truly was, a woman whose strength was rooted in fear and manipulation, rather than in honor and respect. Ugochi's fate served as a powerful reminder to the villagers of what happens when one chooses the path of cruelty over kindness. It was a reminder that power gained through oppression is fleeting and ultimately self-destructive. Ugochi had been a cautionary tale, a woman who had risen by stepping on others, only to fall when the very forces she had sought to control turned against her. Her story was one of caution, but it was also one of redemption. Though she had lost everything, there was still a chance for her to change, to learn from her mistakes, and to seek a new path, though it was unlikely she would ever find the same power she once had. As for Adise, her journey was not just one of personal transformation, but of collective healing. She had endured her suffering in silence, but when the time came she had used her voice, not to demand revenge but to call for the storm, to call for the truth. She had found her strength, not in anger but in understanding. She had learned that true power comes from within, and that the ability to forgive, to teach, and to guide is the greatest strength one can possess. The thunder that had once signaled Adise's suffering had now become a symbol of her triumph. It was a reminder that even in the most trying of circumstances, there is always the possibility of growth and transformation. Adise had shown the village and the world that when one's spirit is tested, it is possible to emerge stronger, wiser, and more connected to the forces that govern the universe. Her story was a beacon of hope for all who had been oppressed, silenced, or forgotten. It was a testament to the power of resilience, the strength of the human spirit, and the transformative power of the earth and the ancestors. In the end, the story of Adise was not just a tale of vengeance or survival, but one of redemption, healing, and transformation. It was a reminder that, no matter how broken or defeated one may feel, there is always the possibility of renewal. The storm that had once brought destruction now symbolized the possibility of rebirth. Adise's first meal, her silence, and the thunder that followed had been the catalyst for change, not just for herself but for the entire village. And in that change there was a lesson for us all, that even in the most difficult moments when all seems lost, there is always the possibility of finding our true power, our true selves, and our true purpose. And so, Adise's story lived on not just as a legend, but as a living, breathing testament to the power of the human spirit, the strength of silence, and the undeniable force of the storm that comes when truth is called forth.